Hello everyone, this is Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore. Welcome to the MuseScore Café. So this is my weekly series I do every Wednesday. Welcome everyone. I pick some aspect of MuseScore to talk about or do some other special session, and we take a look at what's going on. And the topic I picked for today is rhythm, and it's kind of in conjunction with my jazz piano course. I'm trying to do things that I think are relevant for people, and in particular the spelling of rhythm to make it how you spell rhythms to make it readable, and how you get MuseScore to do this for you, and some other MuseScore features that have to do with notating of rhythms. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here. And yeah, tomorrow is the music master class, where I'll be showing some more stuff about actually, coming up with rhythms and so forth. But today we're going to be talking about the process of notating it mostly. The top of the chat there is the link to the Mastering MuseScore School. By all means, please check it out and check out my online course, the Mastering MuseScore Complete Online course, as well as my other courses like the Basic Music Theory course, and I'm going to be referencing that a bit today. So, yeah, I'm looking at my screen, making sure that I've got picture and I have sound, so I will try to keep up with that. Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is this idea of 8 basic rhythms. And yes, I know people who have been following my streams and my courses and so forth have often seen reference to this before, but I'm guessing for some of you it's a new concept, because really it's not one that's taught as such all that often. The fact that at some level there really are, if you define things narrowly enough, there are only 8 rhythms that all other rhythms are assembled from. If you want to think of it as like I don't know, the base pair sequences of DNA. I'm throwing out buzzwords that I think mean something, but I'm not actually sure. Or the 100 and something chemical elements that are known to man. These are everything on this planet is built from those same elements, and music is built from these basic 8 rhythms. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about, what's involved in understanding how this affects notation. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you the rhythms. And it's always instructive to me to put these down, even though I could just load up a worksheet that has already loaded them. But I want you to kind of see the process that I go through in remembering what they are. The way I'm going to show these rhythms is it's the ways that you can fill up a measure using only whole numbers of beats. So in other words, whole notes, half notes, and quarter notes, but also dotted half notes. But we're not going to need and. There is no and in what I'm talking about here. And you might say, but music has and. How can you say that all music is built from this? Just bear with me if you haven't seen this before, and all will become clear. So clearly, you could fill a measure with a whole note, right? You could put a whole note in a measure. And then you can also, what's the next longer note? I'm going to do this. I'd always do this in different orders, but this time I'm going to do it in terms of the next longest note is a dotted half. And if I have a dotted half, the only thing I can put in that measure other than that is a quarter note, right? And then the next the next shortest note is a half note. So I can put a half note in. And then if I have a half note, there's a couple things I could do. I could either have another half note, or I could have 2 quarters, right? And that's it. That's the only way you can start a measure with a half note. Well, what if I start with a quarter note? If I start with a quarter, I could either fill the rest with a dotted half, or I could put in a half note, and then all I got left is a quarter. Or I could put in 2 quarters and put the half note to fill the rest, or I could put 3/4, and I guess I need a 4th quarter too. You can come up with whatever way you want to conceptualize the order that these go in, because it's not significant. But what is significant is that these are the rhythms. And so when I talk about these being the rhythms, if all you have is 4/4 time, and yes, music is not just all in 4/4, and all you have are whole numbers of beats, and yes, music isn't always whole numbers of beats, these are the only ways you can fill up that measure. And what we're going to do is use that information to understand the correct ways of notating other rhythms. So, one thing to realize right away is that these rhythms here, like quarter, dotted half, or dotted half quarter, those are perfectly fine. You don't need ties to write those rhythms. So the next thing that comes up is, well, what if we do have eighth notes? So if I do have eighth notes, then what I'm going to do is cut each of these rhythms in half in my mind. And I'm going to let MuseScore do this for me. And so here I'm showing you a MuseScore feature that you may or may not know about. I'm going to copy that whole passage there. Did I start my demo thing? I think I didn't. Demo. All right, there we go. So Control C to copy. And now I'm going to click here in the next measure here. And I am going to go to the Edit menu and pick Paste Half Duration. This one actually has a shortcut. This isn't one that I customize. It actually has a default shortcut, Control Shift Q. So when I do this, all right, I'm checking. Oh, okay, black chords, nice. All right, cool. So I've now done. Let me just redo that paste half duration. So I'm going to again select that measure and paste half duration. I was just checking the chat. Got distracted for a moment. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to stick in a frame in between. I have a shortcut, Control Alt V, to insert vertical frames between things because I do that fairly often. So this set of rhythms here is half the duration of what I started with. I started with a whole note. Now I have a half note. Started with dotted half quarter. Now I have dotted quarter eighth. Started with 2 halves. Now I have 2 quarters. Started with half quarter quarter. Now I have quarter eighth eighth. So this set of rhythms is exactly the same as my first set of rhythms. So here's my first set of rhythms. I'm being a metronome. All right, so that's that. And let me actually add a section break here so that I get a little pause. These rhythms are exactly the same rhythm. This time I'll let MuseScore be my metronome. And if you can't see, I've got the play panel down in the lower right, and there's a little metronome icon there, but you could also turn it on the toolbar, right? So those are the exact same 8 rhythms that I started with, just twice as fast. I added another section break. Now I'm going to add another vertical frame. By the way, so I defined shortcuts to do the section break and the vertical frame. If you haven't seen before, I go to Edit, Preferences, Shortcuts, and this is where all these commands are. And so like if I type frame in here, you'll see all the horizontal frame, insert text frame, insert vertical frame. Control Alt V because I define that. If you want to define your own shortcut like append vertical frame, I can go hit the define button and then just say what I want it to be. Maybe Shift Alt V. Oh, that's already something, and it tells you that. So clear, click in the box, try again. Shift Alt V. All right, that one works. and then you would hit add to add that as a shortcut. So that's how you can define your own shortcuts. Another thing that I want to do here is, because MuseScore now defaults to indenting the first system of every section of a piece. Every time I put in a section break, it kept indenting everything. I don't actually want that for this, so I'm going to turn that off. So I'm going to go to Format, Style, and right here on the Score tab is Enable Indentation of First System. I'm just going to turn that off. And now my indentation is turned off. So, all right. So these rhythms, again, are half of what these rhythms are. In fact, if I take this and just double the tempo, which I can do by entering a tempo of 200% in the, let me just go ahead and drag the play panel away because I have a feeling I might be using it some. If I set 200% as my tempo and now play that first example, that is exactly the same as what that first one was. So if I now, what the second one is here. Right, these are the same rhythms. So the point is, if you look at now how these rhythms are written, here we have a dotted quarter, but it's a dotted quarter on beat 3. There are certain places, if, how do I put this? When you write rhythms, you want to stick to these, and you want to figure out how to write your rhythms in a way that is consistent with this. And this comes up very often if you're trying to syncopate something, which is what we're doing in the jazz piano course right now. So I want to show an example of what I'm meaning. These 8 rhythms are all you have. If you're going to have a dotted quarter and an eighth, you can have a dotted quarter and an eighth, but they have to exist within a half a measure like this. It's either got to be the first half of the measure or the second half of the measure. If you're using eighth notes in 4/4 time, you imagine the measure being broken up into 2 halves, more generally 2 beat groups. So in 3/4, you look at the first half of the measure as a 2 beat grouping, and then there's 1 beat left over. And you honor these patterns within the 2 beat grouping. So I'm going to enter a rhythm here. And actually, I'm going to simplify this thing. I'm going to make it 2 half notes. And in the course, we've been talking about syncopating things by moving notes later or earlier. Well, what if I want to move this note earlier? Now, the thing is, I can totally use that duration editor plugin. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago, I think, I demonstrated the duration editor plugin, which is a really cool plugin that does a lot of really nice things, but it definitely allows you to shoot yourself in the foot. And so I want to show you how not to. So if I think, oh, if I want to move this half note earlier, that means it's going to be a dotted quarter. So I'm going to change it to a quarter and then dotted. And that leaves me with an eighth rest left over. So I'll just go ahead and enter a D eighth note there, and then tie it. So you might look at this and think, done. I have now syncopated that measure. I have taken that D and moved it a half a beat earlier. Or if you don't know about that plugin, you might have done it just by, for instance, just saying, well, I know I want that C to be shorter, and it's going to be dotted quarter, and then I'll just enter what I want here. I'm going to enter 6D, and then tie it to that eighth note that's left. I mean, depending on how you like to go about editing things, you may end up with this kind of situation. You have a dotted quarter, and then a half, and then an eighth. Well, this is not one of our 8 patterns, so you can't use it. is the idea here. We see there's a half note, there's dotted quarter eighth, there's 2 quarters, and I'm looking at this now as being broke up into 2 measure segments, I mean 2-beat segments. So my first 2 beats are half note, and then dotted quarter eighth, and then quarter quarter, and then quarter eighth eighth, and then eighth dotted quarter, right? So these are my 2-beat patterns. I don't see those patterns here. I see a dotted quarter followed by a half note. That's not in here. That's not one of my 2-beat patterns. So this is important because this is essentially not readable. Yes, you can figure it out. Yes, you can do the math and count it. It sounds exactly correct. It sounds exactly like what I meant, but it is not it is not notated properly. So I'm going to show you what notated properly means as soon as I check out some of these chat comments, because I saw some things show up here. Okay, so the question here, yeah, so some keyboard shortcuts are already taken by the operating system. So when you define keyboard shortcuts, you got to use one that's available. MuseScore will tell you if it's already taken by MuseScore, but it won't be able to tell you if it's reserved by your operating system. I've got several that are reserved by Linux or by my Chromebook that I can't use. Okay, so I did see a question about things, but maybe that's the one that got retracted. I did see a question, something about macros or something, um, but yeah. So there is no macro facility in MuseScore, but there are certainly third-party macro utilities and things. So let's talk about what this rhythm would look like written correctly, and then we'll talk about why that's important and what the exceptions are. The point of all of this is that when we read rhythms, we don't really read them. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but we don't read every note. We recognize patterns, and that's not just for rhythms. That also applies to things like this. If I see this stack of notes here, I don't have to read every single note to understand what that pattern is. It's notes a third apart. I can tell that because they're all on lines. So even if you put that thing in alto or tenor clef where I don't really read the notes, all I got to do is figure out the bottom note and I can play that thing because I recognize the pattern. It's a triad. Well, it's a ninth chord, right? It's chords built by stacking thirds. We read a lot of things that way. We can read scales that way too. And we see line space, line space, line space. If I see something that goes line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space, I know that's an essentially scalar line. And my brain is prepared to process it that way. And then, oh, by the way, I figure out some of the pitches. Well, that kind of thing is really important in reading rhythms because realistically, like, let me switch over to my MuseScore Café theme here. If I zoom way in on this note right here, nothing, you can look at that note and say, hey, that note is an A flat. Well, assuming we know it's treble clef. So I'll tell you it's treble clef. That note's an A flat. That note is an F. That note is a C natural. We know all that just by looking at it. We also can tell by the shape of the note that it's an eighth note. What you can't tell is what beat that note fell on. This is an unfortunate fact of music notation that it doesn't tell you what beat every note is on. It tells you how long the note lasts, but that's not really what's important in being able to play the rhythm accurately. What's important is knowing what note, what beat it falls on. And so instead, we have to deduce that by looking at the entire measure and kind of adding things up and say, here's beat 1, here's beat 2, here is beat 3, and now I can see that's on the end of beat 3. Well, the way I was able to tell that this grouping there was beat 1 is because it's beamed together as one beat. This here is beamed together as one beat. This here is beamed together as one beat. So that when I play this little rhythm, that rhythm, bum, 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 that A flat there is on the end of 3, and I can tell that by looking at it because I don't have to pull out my calculator and say, okay, this is 3/4 of a beat plus 1/4 of a beat plus half a beat plus half a beat plus half a beat. Type all that in and then find out that this is on the end of 3. I don't need to do all that math. I can just block this out and say, that's one beat right there. I can tell it because it got beamed together. This is one beat. I can tell that because it got beamed together. This here is one beat. I can tell it because it got beamed together. So this way that we do things, of beaming things in particular ways and then using ties, like notice this note right here. This is a 16th note tied to an 8th note, right? So that is really a dotted 8th note. So I could have notated it as a dotted 8th note. This here is an 8th note tied to an 8th note. I could have notated that as a quarter note. This is going to sound exactly the same. And I can do the same over here in the bottom staff. When I do that, it changes the layout a little bit. And then this is an 8th note. No, this is a dotted 8th note. So you could have written the measure this way. But when you do this, you cannot tell what beat things are on. We've totally messed up the pattern. And now nothing about this right here is recognizable as the and of 3. The thing that enabled it to be recognizable as and of 3 was the fact that each of the first 2 beats fit one of my patterns. So the pattern, writing your rhythms in ways that reflect the patterns is really kind of important. Like right now, when I look at this D here, it's hard to tell what beat it falls on compared to if I write this the correct way, which is dotted quarter. I use Shift W to add the dot. Basically, it adds a dot to whatever's done, and then if I press Shift W again, it changes it to a half note. Shift Q goes the other way around, shortens one duration at a time. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to enter the D and tie that. Oops, let me undo that. 6 plus to enter the D. So these 2 rhythms are identical, but the second one is written in a way that honors that 2 halves of the measure. I can now see the first half of the measure is dotted quarter 8th, which is this little pattern right here, dotted quarter 8th. The second half of the measure is half note, which is this pattern here. So I've written the rhythm in a way that honors that. So the rule of thumb here is anytime you have a rhythm that involves 8th notes, you mentally divide up your measure into 2-beat groupings, and you make each 2-beat grouping be one of these 8 patterns. And you create and you add ties as necessary. Oh yeah, minim, crotchet, minim, half note, quaver, 8th note, crotchet, quarter. This is the British terms, right? So so this is a basic kind of rule of thumb that says we want to break up our measure into ways that allow us to see the pattern. So if all we've got are 8th notes in our measure, we don't have 16ths, in other words, then breaking it up into 2-beat patterns is how we want to do it. So here are my first 2 beats, dotted quarter 8, and there are my second 2 beats, the half note. So by breaking the pattern up that way, first 2 beats, then second 2 beats, and then tying across that middle of the measure, that's how I get this readable version. And so if I'd had a rhythm, and this comes up now, so this is the one that comes up in salsa music. This rhythm, I'm going to write it with different pitches. This rhythm is breaking that rule. And so this rhythm, normally, under normal circumstances, we would rewrite it so that taking this dotted quarter that's kind of straddling the middle, because right now, this isn't one of those 8 rhythms. I've got a dotted quarter and a dotted quarter. 2 dotted quarters in a row. That's not one of these 8 patterns here, right? So I want to rewrite that. This dotted quarter should be followed by an eighth. So I'll make this be an eighth and then tie it to another eighth. No, tie it, sorry, to a quarter. And so I hit W to double the length of that, and then enter my final quarter. So this would be the normally correct way to write that. It's the exact same rhythm, but this middle note, instead of writing it as a dotted quarter, is written as an eighth tied to a quarter, so I can see the two halves of the measure separately. So I say normally that's the correct thing to do. However, as I'm sure I'm being reminded in the chat, if I check here, in salsa music, this rhythm is so common that it becomes its own pattern. And we make like a special allowance for that rhythm. If it occurs in the context, like when writing out the clave pattern, that rhythm, it's like a part of that rhythm that's so common that it becomes acceptable within that world to write this one. Because now, instead of just saying there's 8 basic patterns, there's 8 basic patterns plus the clave pattern, basically, in writing salsa music. And that's like the one time you get to break that rule. There's a couple other really specific situations like that where there's specific cases where it can be permissible to obscure the middle of the beat if the entire measure is then a recognizable pattern. Another pattern like that is this one. Oops. This pattern here, where we have quarter notes that are all a whole bunch of quarter notes off the beat. This happens enough in jazz, bossa nova, and salsa that this also gets to be a special exception. This is a special pattern that we do allow it to be written this way if you know that's your audience, basically. If you know your audience is people who are accustomed to that pattern, it becomes okay to write that. So double dotted half notes. So double dotted half notes, I mean, if you think about it, um, a dotted half note already obscures the middle of the beat, but at least there's not eighth notes there. And yet, this is considered okay. Dotted half and 2/8. So my little rule of thumb that says whenever there's eighth notes present, you have to split the measure up in half, that's actually going too far. And so the real rule is more complex and more subtle than that. The real rule would say something like, because the patterns say it's okay to put a dotted half note on one, it's okay to put a dotted half note on one, even if there's eighth notes or 16th notes somewhere else. So there's more to the rule than the somewhat simplistic way I described it. But a dotted half note can be on beat one. So the question is, can you put a double dotted half note there? Whoops, double dotted half note here. So double dotted half notes are, I would say they were common at one time and then they fell out of favor. There's really not a great reason why we couldn't use this, but yes, it does mean that we are breaking that half measure rule and there's eighth notes present, but we already just saw that it's okay to break that rule if you've got dotted half and 2/8. So double dotted half 1/8 feels like it should be okay. So this is okay if you're writing in a world in which double dotted half notes are common. So if you are writing for musicians living in the 18th century, by all means, write that. If you're writing for musicians living in the 21st century, this notation has all but disappeared in modern editions. So I don't recommend using it because most musicians have never seen a double dotted half note is basically the deal. It's just not commonly used. So if unless you know you are writing for musicians that are used to reading music that was written and published in the 18th century when this notation was more common. Unless if you're writing for musicians who are used to reading 18th century manuscript, then they'll be used to this and you can do this. But in most contexts, you don't. So most contexts, you don't write this rhythm. But what's interesting is to consider what the alternative is. What I think most people do here is they write a single dotted half note and then tie it to an eighth like this. So they write this rhythm. It's the same rhythm, but it's a dotted half tied to an eighth. This is, I think, the most common way today of writing that rhythm. But when I worked for Hal Leonard producing the Real Book series, we had a different rule. We actually followed that mid-measure rule. The idea was, as long as you're going to have a tie anyhow, okay, without the tie, this rhythm was considered okay. Dotted half, 2/8, that's perfectly fine. But in this case here, you need the tie. There's no way to write a note that lasts for 3.5 beats without a tie. There's no way, there's no like double dot or dot and a half symbol. Well, no, that's not true. There's a double dot. But as soon as you eliminate the double dot from consideration, you realize you're going to need a tie to write this note. So instead, what the Hal Leonard Real Book series does is they actually break this up, honoring that mid-measure thing. So instead of writing dotted half tied to eighth, they write half, so I'll change that to a half, tied to dotted quarter, and then tie that. This is the rhythm you'll see in the real book. So now you can clearly see first half of the measure is the half note, second half of the measure, dotted quarter eighth. So that idea of splitting up the measure that way to make this rhythm easier to read is yeah, there's some subjectivity to it, absolutely. The 3/3/2 rhythm similar, it's called a tresillo. I don't actually know that word. Interesting. So yeah, the double dotted half is definitely out of favor for most modern editors, but it is used only when reproducing the look of 18th century manuscript, where it was more common. There's certain situations where, like, if you're dealing with like double dotted eighth 32nd pattern, that pattern gets a little ugly to do with ties. So like this pattern here, if I do an eighth note double dotted and then have a 32nd note, this pattern here is a little awkward to do with ties, because then I would have to break it up. How would I have to break that up? Well, I could do it. It's the same issue is going to show up. I could show it as an eighth note tied to a dotted 16th. So I'm going to hit 4 dot for dotted 16th plus the tie, and then put in my 32nd note E. So this is extremely awkward because we are tying notes that are beamed together. And then we could choose to break that beam if we wanted to. We could go to beam properties, break that beam. But this is awkward also because this is all one beat. We usually like to beam a beat together. So this is like a not very good situation. It's a rock and a hard place. So this is the only situation where I think any modern editor would go for the double dotted eighth notes. Similarly for double dotted 16ths, but they're incredibly rare. But this pattern here, let me just put in 2 of those. I'm going to select that and press R to double it. By double it, I mean repeat it. So that pattern there, bum, ba-dum, 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 it's the double dotted eighth 32nd pattern. When you have that pattern, which again isn't all that common in contemporary music-ish compared to how it was, say, in certain like Baroque music, it could be a little more common. So when you have that pattern, that's a situation where the double dots happen. So Oh yeah, Barry Harris died recently. I heard that. It was actually, I think, yesterday, because I started seeing news about it. Either that or he became ill enough that the word started to go out. So trying to just check up because I'm kind of jumping around here, and as is typical in the cafe, just sort of answering questions and jumping around because I do actually want to go back to my theme music here and show something in particular about it. So yeah, this pattern here is fine, the double dotted eighth, 32nd. This pattern here is common in jazz, bossa nova, salsa, Latin American music in general. That syncopated series of syncopated quarter notes. However, if you were writing that for classical musicians, I would recommend not doing that. I would recommend doing the same thing here of recognizing that eighth, quarter, that pattern should be this one here, eighth, quarter, eighth. And so this can't be a quarter note here. We want to break it up into an eighth note and then another eighth note and then tie them together. So this is how you would want to write that for classical musicians, where now you can see the two halves of the measure, eighth, quarter, eighth, and eighth, quarter, eighth, where the eighths in the middle happen to be tied together. To me, I'm so used to that version with the quarter straddling the line. I'm very okay with that. I'm personally not as okay with this, but I don't play as much salsa music as the people, Michael, Fret the Spaceman in there do. So that this pattern, dum, bum, that pattern there, the clave pattern, is so pervasive in salsa music that you do end up getting it written this way, and people don't bat an eye at it, just like that ba-dum, bum, bum, bum. Ooh, that's the McDonald's theme, right? Ba-dum, bum, bum, bum. That's exactly what that is, except with other pitches or random pitches. So ba bum 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 bum. Eighth, quarter, 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 quarter. Where that last quarter does have to be tied across the bar because you've only got 4 beats in the measure. So one thing I haven't talked about yet are 16th notes, and I want to talk about 16th notes. So I'm going to do that briefly. I'm going to insert myself a couple more measures here. And now I'm going to select that lovely eighth note pattern. And now I'm going to do another paced half duration. The paced half duration now is giving me those same patterns in represented where that half note has now become a quarter note. The dotted quarter eighth has become dotted eighth 16th. The quarter quarter has become eighth eighth. The quarter eighth eighth has become eighth 16th 16th, etc. So now these patterns, these are now those same 8 basic rhythms represented in 16ths. Well, that is absolutely the key. And by the way, I'm very aware that I messed up this rhythm here in the course of playing with this thing. And so it no longer reflects my 8 basic rhythms. So I've been wanting to fix that. So there we go, dotted half, quarter. All right, so these 16th rhythms, notice now that not only is it a question of dividing by half measure, it's a question of dividing beat by beat, because each beat is now one of those 8 patterns. Beat 1 is the quarter. Beat 2 is the dotted quarter 16th. Beat 3 are the 2 eighths. Beat 3 is the eighth and 2 16ths, and so forth. So each beat is now set up this way, and they're all beamed individually. That's what enabled things like my cafe theme to work. Here's my not very good version of it, where I have dotted eighth beamed together. That is not a thing. If you look at the things that are a thing, dotted eighths are always beamed with 16ths to complete the beat. Either it's a dotted eighth followed by a 16th, or a dotted eighth preceded by a 16th, but either way, they're beamed together to say this is one beat. So we basically can't have this 2 dotted eighths beamed together. Instead, we want this to be back what it was before. I'm just going to undo all my changes here and undo a million times. And this is my rhythm here. So it's this thing here, that second hit there was a 16th, because I want, remember, it was a dotted eighth conceptually as far as its duration, but I'm writing it as 16th tied to eighth, so that my beat 1 is now very clearly, it's the dotted eighth, 16th beamed together. I see a very clear beat 1. Beat and eighth beamed together. Yes, that first eighth was tied over from the previous measure, but it allows me to see the beats individually. And so now I know that that second eighth note there is on the and of 2. And then similarly, I have 2/8 beamed together, and so I know that this A flat is on the and of 3, because I can clearly see beat 1 is dotted eighth 16th, beat 2 is 2/8, beat 3 is 2/8, beat 4 is 16th dotted eighth. So when I talk about that this is important for reading, it really is, because people who read this kind of music, so now we're dealing with kind of, I don't know, this isn't really funk specifically, but funk rhythms in general have a lot of this kind of notation. Notations in 16th notes, basically, with these kinds of patterns, dotted eighths and 16ths tied across the bar. These are all syncopation. So the definition of syncopation, the short definition of syncopation, is a note on a weak beat or an off beat that is not immediately followed by one on the next strong beat. So in other words, I've got a 16th note here. I have a note here on the, on beat 1. This is 1E and This second note here is on the of 1, but it's not followed by a note on 2. Yes, there's a blob of ink there, which is important for me to be able to keep count, but there's no sound on beat 2. The note's tied over. So that 16th on the of 1 is syncopated. These rhythms, when they get highly syncopated, this business of very clearly marking your individual beats is absolutely crucial to being able to make this be readable. So when I count this, I'm going to count this 1 and so I can, if I think about the beats, the first beat is bum, ba. That's the first beat. If I think about the second beat, it's bum. If I think about the third beat, it's bum. And if I think about the fourth beat, it's 1 for E and for E, right? For E, da dum, ba, bum. And I can read each of these beats individually. Bum, bottom, bum, bum, bum. So I know what each of these patterns sounds like, because there's only 8 patterns. I've seen each of these 10,000 times in my life. I actually don't know the number. Maybe it's 1,000,000 times. I don't know. I've seen each of those 8 patterns so many times that once you realize that the music is written in a way that allows you to recognize those patterns, you can take advantage of it. And so you can easily read complex rhythms like this by seeing it one beat at a time. Bum, and I'll just ignore the ties for now, and then I'll add the ties back in. Bum, ba bum bum boom bum boo bum ba bum ba bum bum bum, and then all I got to do is skip the ties. Bum ba bum ba ba bum bum ba ba. Right? All I did is I made a little noise to say where that tied note would have been. But or if I want to clap, I could clap and miss. Bum ba bum 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 ba bum. But now I'm going to clap and miss. Bum ba bum. Oops, I did it backwards, right? Because I don't do that. Bum bum. There we go. That's the right way to do it. But that's how I'm thinking of it. I'm thinking of it as each of these is an actual note, but some of them just don't get played. Bum ba don't bum don't bum don't ba. And by seeing each of those beats as one of those 8 patterns, you can read this stuff. And that's why it is so, so crucial to write it that way. Now, I'm seeing that there's some additional comments in here that I want to catch up with. So this is good. there's one thing I want to show you, and then I'm going to read this thing here. Last dotted eighth should be a 16th. Yeah, I probably messed something up somewhere, but I'm not sure where. So you'll have to tell me where I'm talking about, where you're talking about, Brian. But the thing I want to show you is that MuseScore can do some of this for you. So for instance, this measure here that I started off with, the dotted quarter, half, eighth that I said is written wrong, all you have to do is go to Tools, Regroup Rhythms, and it fixes it. It's not perfect. It doesn't know everything. So for instance, I'm not sure what it will do. I just selected that E and made it a quarter note. I suspect when I select this and say regroup rhythms, it's going to split up that E because it's going to be really specific about following that rule. Yeah, it did. So that it's maybe a little overly aggressive because I think in most of the settings in which I would have written that rhythm, people are going to know how to read it because I write that rhythm in jazz charts. I don't write that rhythm in classical music very often. What about this rhythm here with the dotted eighth, the double dotted eighth? I have no idea what it's going to do to that. So let's find out. Regroup rhythms. Oh my gosh, look, yeah. So what it did is it did, in fact, do the thing that I said was a little ugly of tying within a beamed group. So this is an eighth tied to a dotted 16th. This is correct, but see what I mean about this being a little awkward? It's not normal that you would have two notes that are both beamed and tied, because the way that most things work out in notation is if you look at like my cafe theme, the ties exist they don't exist within a beat. Within a beat, we already know we can write these patterns right here. So those 8 patterns, the only patterns that normally exist, don't require ties. The ties only exist not within beats, but between beats. So that's another important clue that we normally have to where the beats are. It's where the ties are leading into. So this version that MuseScore created here of eighth tied to dotted 16th, I mean, yes, it's kind of correct, but it is awkward because it means that now we have a tie within a beamed group, within a single beat, and it's just a little odd. It's not something we see every day. So I'm going to try to catch up here a little bit in uh, um, in the chat here because um, I want to make sure I address the comments in here. So, by the way, Colleen, about Barry Harris, yeah. So the drop two voicing technique and the alternating diminished chords that I talk about in the block chord lesson, that is straight up Barry Harris, right? Barry Harris. I'm not going to say he invented that whole business, but he put it on the map. Sorry, I had my sound on my phone, so you were probably hearing weird echoes. But that whole idea of alternating block chords with diminished chord passing chords is absolute classic Barry Harris. That's his methodology. And then doing drop two voicings on it is just, building on that. So, all right. So I'm trying to catch up. Is it possible to include a code panel? You could alter some. So Julio, that's an interesting question. I would suggest starting a discussion on the forum, like put it in the general discussion forum on musescore.org. That would be a good place for that kind of discussion to say what kinds of things you feel like, because MuseScore doesn't have a text-based language, and yet because I can enter everything with keyboard shortcuts, it kind of does, right? The text language for this measure here would be 4C, 5D, 4E plus 5F, 4G plus. That would be a text language for that measure because that's the keyboard shortcuts for entering it. So you could think of that as a text language. And yeah, it would be possible to come up with such a thing. Probably someone could even write a plugin for it, but I think some discussion on the forum would be good to help understand maybe what you have in mind, how it might actually work. So let's see. Let's see. Adding chord tones across ties. Oh, there's a thing you should know about this. So like right now, and I'm gonna have to remember how this goes, but I'm glad this came up. Right now, I have this E tied across the bar, tied across the middle of the measure. What if I decide a chord? I want to add a G to it. If I just press Shift, I just get the G chord, not on the second. Or if I go into note input mode and type Shift G, kind of the same thing. There's a number of commands that have to do with adding ties. I think what the deal is, if I add the G, oh man, I wish I could remember this. If I add the G, Shift G, and then hit plus, notice what it did. It replaced. So right now I've got a G and an E, and only the E is tied. If I type plus to tie that G, it says, "Oh, I'll tie that G for you," but it obliterates the E and the tie that was there. So unfortunately, the plus command is really awkward. However, there is a second tie command that got implemented in MuseScore sometime within the last year or two that I always forget, and I defined a shortcut for it recently, but can I remember it? No. So I'm going to type tie into this. It's add tied note to chord, Alt plus. Oh, well, that's pretty clear. All right, so let's see. I'm going to type Alt plus and see what I get. So actually, I'm not sure if it's going to be, if I'm going to need to press Shift when I do it because the way my keyboard is set up, but I'm going to try it without the plus first, without the Shift first. Nope, that didn't do it. So with Shift. All right, so that works. I defined that shortcut. I don't think it was there by default, or maybe it is by default. But no, what it does is it lets me add that G tied while preserving the existing E. So it's a little less awkward than it would have been otherwise, if you know about that. But of course, it's a lot easier to get it right the first time, because if I get it right the first time, like if I enter a D on the offbeat and then I enter my E and G together, then press plus to tie, it does it correctly. So it's definitely easier to deal with tied chords if you do it directly in note input mode, as opposed to try to add stuff to it later. But at least that command is somewhat useful. Okay, so oh yeah, so yeah, and also if you've already entered the chord without the tie, then you can select the chord or the stem. So if I didn't have the ties here, I'll delete them one by one. If I select the whole chord and press plus, it adds it to the whole chord. Or if you can select the stem, that also works. Then press plus to tie an existing chord. But that requires you to have entered the two chords separately already. So I realized that what I just did was a lot of kind of skipping around here, because it is an important topic that I talk about periodically, but I really wanted to get into this here because, because of the jazz piano holiday course, we're doing a lot of things involving syncopated rhythms. So I'm just going to show you my syncopated version of my piece here that I've been working on, and just show you how it actually works in that respect. So let's see, I'll just do the rhythm version here. So when I play you this here, let's do it without the metronome. So the comment that I made in the lesson where I presented this version here is that this is actually messy and hard to read. I would not be happy if someone gave me this to read. I actually would rather have it written without all the syncopations, and then as a jazz musician, improvise them. However, if I were to want to give music to someone who isn't familiar with improvising that much, this is readable. This is totally using all of those techniques. So here, boo, bum, bum. That's eighth, quarter, eighth. That first half of the measure there is totally written according to, those 8 patterns that I had going here. It's this guy right here, eighth, quarter, eighth, right? And then the second half of the measure is actually got 2 voices going on. The top voice is quarter, eighth, eighth. Bottom voice is half. Well, those are also my 8 patterns, right? Everything here is one of my 8 patterns. That is just the point. So there's places where I have, like here, 2 eighths tied together rather than a quarter. Why? Because it's necessary to show the 2 halves of the measure. The first half of the measure in the second voice there is dotted quarter, eighth. The second half of the measure in that voice is eighth, dotted quarter. So it's really when you're taking something that was originally written without all those syncopations, because my original version of that was not syncopated. It's the exact same notes, but without the syncopations. Literally the same notes. All that's different between them is that I moved some notes over by half a beat. I think I introduced 1 or 2 extra notes somewhere. But so like that rhythm in that first measure, boop, bum, bum, that A is on the and of 1, the G is on the and of 2, but they started on 2 and 3. They just got moved over by half a beat. So this is what I was teaching in the lesson, was moving notes over a half a beat to create syncopations. But in doing so, it's just vitally important to write them correctly. And if I hadn't, if I had written that as a dotted quarter, and I don't know if MuseScore, if Regroup Rhythms would have fixed that despite the multiple voices, but now I want to find out. I'm going to go to Tools, Regroup Rhythms. Well, it did something weird. I think, is this really a quarter note? Oh, yeah, I'm not. Yeah, it actually messed it up. Now that I'm looking at it, it did something weird because these are I guess it's because the ties are in different voices. That's another tricky thing here. The top note here is tied into a voice 1 note. It's voice 1, but the bottom 2 notes are in voice 2. And I think the Regroup Rhythms command got a little carried away with the multiple voices. So the question that Joanne asked here is something I have to kind of leave you with. Other time signatures, do they have different rules? Yes, they kind of do, but no, they don't. The same 8 rhythms apply. So in 3/4 time, basically, we just look at the first 2 beats and say it's got to be one of these 8 patterns here. And then the third beat it's only 1 beat. So it's easy to deal with. That's my but you want the first 2 beats of 3/4 to be recognizable together. 6/8, then each beat we want to be one of its patterns, and now there's basically if we only think about eighth notes, there's only 3 eighth notes in that pattern instead of 4. There's actually fewer patterns that are possible for 1 beat of 6/8. But as long as you show each beat separately, you're good. So in my basic music theory course, I do go on at great length about how the rules get adapted for 3/4 and 6/8. So if you go to and Joanne, I know you're currently an all access member, so you have access to the basic music theory course. If you go to that course and check out the rhythm section, there is a couple sections where I go pretty deep into 3/4 and 6/8 and how those rules work. But it really is the same thing. We want to still break things up in such a way that we can see these groupings. So in 3/4 time, I want to see things like, let me just do a quick little 3/4 example. I want to see rhythms like, I don't want to see dotted quarter, dotted quarter. I don't want to see this rhythm, except in jazz, I actually don't mind it. This rhythm here, 2 dotted quarters, is common enough in jazz waltzes that it's another one of these exceptions. But usually we break it up so that we have a dotted quarter and then an eighth tied to a quarter. So as long as you get your first 2 beats to be one of your 8 recognizable patterns, the last beat kind of takes care of itself. So that is basically my answer there. Usually you try to get the first 2 beats to be readable. Every once in a while, a measure will present itself where maybe it looks a little nicer to look at the second 2 beats and get those to be one of the 8 patterns. And so there's some subjectivity that comes in, but it's still the case that in general, we are trying to take advantage of people's ability to recognize the 8 basic patterns. All right, so I've talked about a bunch of things here. So I hope, it's a lot of stuff to unpack if it's new to you. But by all means, I highly recommend that you maybe review this, check out the lessons in the basic music theory course, sign up for it if you haven't already, and really study how this rhythm notation works. I've showed you some of the concepts, some of how to do these things in MuseScore, the key idea being adding these ties where necessary. And in the end, hopefully you can create music that is both syncopated, interesting, and easy to read. That's the goal here. So with that said, I am going to now sign out and wish everyone a good day. This has been Marc Sabatella with Mastering MuseScore and the MuseScore Café. And we've been talking about rhythm and the 8 basic rhythms and how it permeates how we notate things, how we break things up into patterns so that we can read them, and how reading them in terms of those patterns really allows you to read some pretty complicated rhythms pretty well once you catch on to it. So again, if you're not enrolled in my basic music theory course and you want to learn more about it, I've got a lot more in there. Maybe organized somewhat, less sporadically than this. So here you're getting to see a lot of these rhythms here and listen to what they sound like. So tomorrow, Music Masterclass, I'll be talking some more about rhythm and syncopation as well as whatever else people need help with, but we'll be focusing, as we have been in general, on the Jazz Piano Holiday course, which actually is wrapping up. I mean, next week will be the last week of the course, and we've come a long ways. We've got some really amazing music, so whether you've been taking part in it or not, I hope you are checking in the Masterclass and just hearing some of the things that people are creating, because it's really quite amazing, I think, what people have been able to do following these techniques. So I'm going to sign off, and I will see you tomorrow or next week or whenever I see you. Next week in the cafe will be the page of the month, if I'm doing my math correctly. Should be the third. No, wait a minute. Is it? What is this? Yeah, it'll be the third week of the month, so page of the month. And by all means, go to my community site and post some suggestions for a page you'd like to see me enter, so that I can show you how I enter some real music into MuseScore. All right, everyone. See you next